Today, we're going to talk about the Guest User Lifecycle Management in your Azure AD. In part one of the video, I've talked about how the guest users are actually getting created in your Azure AD. Some of them are actually getting created by your users itself. To learn more about how the users are getting created, you can watch part one of the video, which I'll leave the link in the description of this video. Now, this video, we're going to look at how you can actually further restrict the creation of those guest accounts and how you can actually manage the overall life cycle of those guest users in your Azure AD and how to clean up all of your user accounts, the guest users in your Azure AD. So let's go and have a look. So I'm currently logged on onto portal.azure.com and I'm into the Azure Active Directory. Now we're going to look at how you can actually restrict the creation of guest users in your Azure AD first, right? So under your Azure AD, you can click on external identities. So once you click on external identities, then we go to external collaboration settings. So under collaboration settings, we have number of options how you can actually manage those guest users. The first one is about guest user access. Now we have three options. The middle one, which is basically guest users have limited access to properties and memberships of directory objects, is the default option, which is basically mostly for most of the organizations unless you have actually changed this option. Now, the first option basically says guest users have the same access as members. So what this means is, all of these guest users will basically have the same access of all of your members. So they can actually look at all the groups and memberships and, all the applications and certificates, etc. If I click on learn more about the guest user access, this actually gives us more in-depth view. So you can actually go and have a look at this learn more page on Microsoft, and which talks more about what are the different options and how you should actually configure based on your requirements. So if I click on the default user permissions in Azure Active Directory, it takes us to the page where it actually talks more about the full description about what they can actually see. Now, if I go back to external identities, so this is the default option. So let's have a look at the default option first. So the default option basically gives your guest users, the permissions to read their own properties, read display name, change their own passwords, read manager, and direct report information of other users. But the other thing is basically which says, about groups. It can actually read properties of non-hidden groups, including memberships and ownership, even non-joined groups, which basically means they can also look at the membership of the groups which they have not joined, right? Which might be something that you don't want, right? So that's something to think about. On the other hand, we have this third option, restricted guest user permissions. So if I go back to my Azure AD, which is basically is the third option, right? So that third option, which is guest user access, is restricted to properties, right? So if we go there, that option basically gives them access to read object ID for joined groups and read membership and ownership of joined groups in some Microsoft 365 apps. So they can basically look at the membership of the groups which they have joined only. You can compare both of these and you can basically decide what they should be doing. But I guess in general case, you don't want your guest users to just wander around and looking at the properties of the memberships of the other users and look at your org charts and org history of the users and stuff. So I would suggest to change it to the third option so that they only have access to their own properties. Unless you have a different requirements, you can definitely change those properties. The next one is about the guest invite settings. Now this is kind of more interesting, and this is what I've talked about in my previous video, how the guest users are actually getting created. Now the first one is basically is the default option, all right, which basically says anyone in the organization can invite guest users. Now, including guests and non-admins. So if you have added a guest in your Azure AD, they can actually invite other guests as well. Obviously the guests are getting created when someone adds users to the 365 groups or teams or SharePoint 365 groups or SharePoint groups as well, right? So that's that. But you have other options. I mean, the last one basically says, no one in the organization can invite guest users, including admins. I guess you probably don't want to do that unless you don't collaborate with external users. But that leaves us with two other options, right? The first one is member users and users assigned to specific admin roles can invite guest users. What it means is if you have any users who are assigned to specific roles, plus your guest users, which are added as member users, they can also invite guest users, right? The third one is only users assigned to specific admin roles can invite guest users. Now, these specific admin roles are basically the roles defined by Microsoft. So if we click on Learn More, it will give us an information about what these roles are basically. So if I go further down and within the description, it talks more about these settings. So the third option which we're talking about is basically only users assigned to specific admin roles. Now these admin roles are basically global admin, user admin role, and a guest inviter role. So if you want to maintain the invitation for your guest users, you can actually select this option. And then you can basically create a group and assign membership to that group, and that sorry, not a membership but a role to that group, one of these roles, and those users then will be able to invite guest users. This is something you can think about. Obviously you probably need to create a process around it so that if someone wants to add someone to a SharePoint slide or a Teams 365 group or Microsoft Teams, then they will probably need to raise a request with your IT or whatever the process you have, and then those users who are assigned these roles, they can actually add those guest users in your Azure AD. So that way you can control the creation of those guest users in your Azure AD, right? So this is about the guest invitee settings, right? And the third one is external users leave settings. Now, if you have this yes and no, which basically says the external users can actually remove themselves from your Azure AD, I would recommend putting it yes, because that way if the user doesn't want to be part of your Azure AD or tenancy, they can remove themselves. Now, the last option is about the collaboration restrictions. You can basically limit the invitations to the specific domains as well. You can allow the invitations to be sent to any domain, which is most inclusive, which means users or admin can invite guest users from any domain. You can actually create um, a list to deny invitation to specific domains. So, which could be, I don't know, gmail.com or hotmail.com, those sort of domains, or any domains that your organization doesn't work with. You can actually also create a list of allowed domains. So the invitations can only be sent to the allowed domains. So, this page basically gives you more controls over how the guest users can actually be invited in your Azure AD, and what sort of access they can actually have, right? So this is something to look for. So that was more about the control on the guest user invitations and access about guest users. But let's say you have got the guest users now, and you have to maintain your Azure AD and obviously do the cleanups and just make sure that, if the guest users are no longer required, they need to be, deleted, or someone needs to take some ownership on those guest accounts. So that you can actually do with access reviews. Let's go and have a look how that works. So again, from Azure AD, I'll click on external identities. And under external identities, there is access reviews under lifecycle management. Now, you do need P2 license for the access reviews to work, right? So let's just create a new access review and have a look how this works. We are onto this screen, new access reviews, right? So if I click on the drop down, there are a couple of options. There is teams plus groups, and there is applications. So we're talking about the guest users. Most of our guest users are basically in the teams and groups, right? Unless we actually create applications and add them to specific applications as well. So you can select that option. Let's have a look at the teams and groups first. So if I click on teams and groups, now under teams and groups, I have two options. The first one is all Microsoft 365 groups with guest users. Now, this is more appropriate for us because we want to target all the 365 groups which are created in your Azure AD, right? Which might be created as part of your MS Teams, or some are created manually and added, guest users. So this will cover all the 365 groups. Okay, let's select this option. Um, and then you also have an option to exclude any particular groups. So you can click on that, and you might have some, I don't know, some confidential groups, or some important groups. You can actually exclude those groups as well. So we don't want to do that right now. And the scope is basically guest users only, so which is fine. Now this particular option, this is basically in public preview, and B2B direct connect users and teams in shared channels are included in access reviews. B2B direct connect users and teams are not supported in reviews of all Microsoft 365 groups with guest users, which is basically that option that we selected, as well as review scope to inactive users. Right? You can learn more about this, what's included and what's not included. But what it says is basically all the B2B direct connect users, which you can actually specify using your cross tenancy settings, they are not supported in the reviews of all 365 groups with guest users, right? But it's going to cover most of your guest users, which are coming, normally within your Azure AD. Okay, so we can further select this option, which basically says inactive users on tenant level only. So when enabled, only users that have been inactive since a specified date will be included in the review. So you can further restrict it as well, right? If we click on that, we can just say if the users have been inactive for the number of days, which you can actually obviously change. We do want to do that because we want to have a look, what users and how many days they have been inactive. So we select that option, 30 days is fine, and we click next reviews. Now, the next section is about the review process, right? You can create a multi-stage review. Or you can create a single stage review. So if I click that option, it basically gives me the first stage review, second stage review, and the review results. You can actually add a third stage as well if you want to do that. Why stages? Is basically about the ownership and process. So for example, under the reviews, if I have a look, there are reviewers options, which is the group owners, and selected users or groups, and users review their own access, and manager of users. So each stage you can target a specified group. For example, in the first stage, I might want to send an email to all the group owners so that they take ownership and say, these are the guest users which you want to remove from your AD. Or you can basically send a first email to the users itself so they can review their membership, and it actually filters down, and then the next stage will be to the group owners as well, right? So we're just going to look at the first stage in this video. So let's just say select reviewers, and if I select group owners, so the group owners takes the responsibility. So every MS team you create, every 365 you create, if you have the group owners specified, the email will actually go to those group owners with the list of guest users, and then they will review that if these guest users are required in our Azure AD, right? You can specify fallback reviewers if the group reviewers are, if the group owners are not available. So you can click on fallback reviewers. This could be individual users, or this could be your IT admins, depending on what sort of process you specify. And then you specify the duration of the review. Let's just say we want to do it in 6 days, or you can just do it in 3 days. And you can select the review occurrence. This happens every quarter, for example, right? Or this happens every month. And what's the start date? And what's the end date? So once you have all those settings set up, then you can click on next settings. And under next settings on that next page, it actually talks about what to do if those conditions are met, if those reviews are basically created. So the first one is auto apply results to resource. So if I hover over the information icon, it basically says if the user access is denied, their access to the resource will be removed after the review is completed. So when you get an email, you can the manager or the group owner can say, yep, we want to deny the access for this user, right? The user is no longer required. And then that user will be removed once the review is completed. There is an option if the reviewers do not respond, right? So you can select what to do. You can say no change, don't do anything about it. You can remove access, you can approve access, or you can take recommendations. So let's just say we want to say no change, because we further want to review. If the reviewer hasn't responded, we just don't want to remove the users from our Azure AD. And this is something for the reviewers to make decisions. So no sign in within 30 days, we check this option. So when the email goes out to your group owners or to the user itself, it basically says these are the users who haven't signed in last 30 days, right? That's in preview, user to group affiliation. So which is basically, it says the system recommends reviewers to deny users. So this is the recommendation by the system itself, which is based on their affiliation with other users within the group, right? But obviously for this to work, users should have manager attribute for this decision helper to work. So you need to make sure that there is a manager attribute for the users. Advanced settings, we have the justification, so which basically says it requires a reviewer to supply a reason for approval, right? So if the user is going to, or if the owner is going to approve the request, then they need to provide the justification for that, which might be set something like the guest user still needs access because of the duration of the project, or whatever reason the reviewer might have. And then obviously we want to send email notifications as well, which basically Azure AD to send email to reviewers when the access review starts and to the review owners when a review completes, right? So they get email notifications. They do get reminders as well. So there is an option. So if enabled, Azure AD will send emails for in-progress access reviews to all reviewers during the midpoint of the review period. So if you specify the review period for 6 days, probably about in the middle of those 6 days, they will get another reminder. And there are some additional contact for reviewer email. So rather than just sending a blank email, here is it, just review it, you can basically say you are getting this because we have found that these are the guest users in your Azure AD which have been inactive, so the owners needs to take some sort of action on it, right? So once we have specified these options, then we can basically just go next and create. And you can provide the name for this access review and some description, and then you can simply create this. All right. So once the review is created, it will appear under your access reviews. So if I refresh this basically has created, and it's basically says not started, which is depending upon when do you want to start it. So and it will kick off soon, basically. Here is the other one which I have basically created earlier. So if I click on that, under that it basically gives you the status, right? The access review found 2 users, and it tells you how many are not reviewed, how many are approved, how many are denied, right? So it gives you a status of your access reviews. It tells you the results as well. So, these are the two users. They have denied the outcome, and based on your settings, these are the results and whatever happened to those access reviews. And if I click on reviewers, obviously I selected the resource owners as the reviewers. So, this tells me about the reviewers are, and these are the settings that I have actually selected for this particular review to take place. All right, so it gives you all that. And then obviously you have audit logs as well. So coming back to access reviews, right? This is, you can actually target your guest users, and you can make sure that your actually Azure AD is, clean and is properly managed. This is basically a automated way of managing the life cycle of your guest users in your Azure AD. The only guest users access reviews doesn't touch are the guest users who are created by the SharePoint site groups. So if someone added a guest user to your SharePoint site groups, those users are not actually captured by the access reviews, because access reviews only works on the Microsoft 365 groups. So, this is something you need to be mindful of. How to basically tackle all of those guest users who are basically created by your SharePoint site groups. Obviously, you can run reports and just see what sort of the sign-in activities for those users are, and then you can perhaps create some sort of process to clean up those users. And obviously, when I was looking at the access reviews, you can not only target all 365 groups. I mean, there are other options as well. You can basically target specific teams and groups. You might run a project for X number of days, and you added all those guest users in that particular Teams channel or Teams group, and you probably may want to just target that particular Teams group or Teams channel for your access reviews. But having said that, you can create multiple access reviews and manage the lifecycle of your guest users in your Azure AD. Well, I guess that was it for today. Do watch the first video, how the guest users are actually getting created in your Azure AD. That's really important to understand, what are the different ways these guest users are actually getting created. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments and feedback section. And please don't forget to hit like and subscribe to my channel. I'll be posting more videos about Azure AD and guest user management and around 365. And that's it for today. I hope to see you again. Thank you.